I hope you're enjoying this beautiful weather we've been having. I want to talk to you tonight because it is Good Friday and we're on the cusp of Easter. Easter being the biggest day, not only for the church, but really for the history of mankind, though unfortunately some don't see it, they don't recognize it. I do want to warn you, though, that this message is not a feel-good, inspirational message, but it's real and it is important. See, I don't think that we can fully understand or fully appreciate the power, the joy, and the blessing of Easter until we understand the horror that was that Friday. Until we understand that that Friday began on Thursday night for Jesus. And I want to share with you 4 ways in which Jesus was broken on that day. The first way, Jesus was broken emotionally. As I said, this had begun earlier in Jesus' ministry as he was heading towards Jerusalem. Luke chapter 12, verses 49 and 50 tell us this. Jesus said, "I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled, but I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it's completed." You see, Jesus' emotions were already getting worked up before he even got to Jerusalem, before the triumphal entry, before the Last Supper, before Good Friday. After that Passover meal that he had, what's now known as the Last Supper, Jesus took his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane and said these words to Peter, James, and John before going off a little further to pray. He said, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Going a little further, he fell to the ground, and according to Luke's gospel, he sweat drops of blood while crying out in agony to his Father, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But if it's not possible, not my will, but yours be done." Certainly, Jesus was broken emotionally. Jesus was also broken relationally. When Jesus finished praying the 3rd time, a crowd came up and to arrest him. They were sent from the priests, from the temple, and they came to arrest him. They were led by Judas, one who had been a friend and had been a confidant. Judas had been part of that ministry for over 3 years, and now that relationship was broken as he sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. Now, Mark tells us that upon his arrest, and you can find this in Mark chapter 14, verse 50, that everyone deserted him and fled, including a young man who, when he was captured, wriggled out of his clothes and ran off naked. He was more concerned about getting away than he was about his pride. These were the same ones who just a few hours before at dinner had sworn their allegiance and boasted about how they were willing to die with Jesus. And now, with a small crowd, they all ran away, deserting him. Oh, we know that Peter and John followed from a distance and went into the courtyard. Well, listen to what it says in Luke chapter 22, verses 60 through 62. It tells us that Peter denied Jesus, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And on that 3rd time, as Jesus had predicted just a short while before, the rooster crowed, and Jesus turned around and looked at Peter. Peter went out and wept bitterly. And, much is said and much has been said about how Peter must have felt and how he went out in anguish, knowing that he had just denied even knowing Jesus. He had spoken so boldly and so confidently, and yet when it came to it, he denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. And the third time, Jesus turned and looked at him as the rooster crowed. And we talk about how much that must have hurt Peter, but imagine for a moment how Jesus felt. Not only had one sold him out and all the others run off, but now one who was one of his closest friends. Peter was one of the inner 3, Peter, James, and John. They got to do more things with Jesus than anybody else. He denied even knowing who Jesus was, and Jesus heard the words, and he heard the rooster crow, and he turned in time to see Peter and watch Peter run off. Jesus was broken relationally. The third way Jesus was broken, and you need to understand this isn't a literal breaking. The Bible tells us, and it had been prophesied, that not a bone of Jesus would be broken, but Jesus' body was broken. He was broken physically. After being arrested and enduring a mock trial, complete with being slapped and hit and spit on and having his beard torn, being mocked, mock worshiped, he was sent back to Pilate, who had him flogged. Now, you need to understand what this flogging was. It wasn't how we see oftentimes depicted in movies where they take a whip and just whip a person 4 or 5 times. This whip was a specially made whip by the Romans. They were experts in torture. And this whip had leather thongs, and on the ends of those thongs, there would be pieces of lead, 1-ounce balls of lead. There would be nails embedded in the lead. There'd be glass embedded in the lead. They would oftentimes embed bone from a sheep's skull into the lead. They would dip the leather straps into water, make it sting all the more, and they would whip the person. And as Jesus clung to that rail there, they would bring that whip across, and it would snap, and it would go across his body. And oftentimes those nails and the glass and the bone, it would dig in to the skin, and it would rip the skin, and it would rip the muscle. Many people who endured a Roman flogging didn't survive their entrails being spilled out onto the ground. This was a violent beating, and Jesus endured this. And after he endured that, they placed his cross upon his back and made him carry it through town, through the crowds, up a hill, to Golgotha, the place of the skull. Something else I'd like you to understand about this beating and how horrific it was. Isaiah had prophesied in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14. Listen to the words that Isaiah uses. This is out of the NIV. This is in reference to the Messiah, in reference to Jesus and his beating. It says, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. Now, I've watched the movie The Passion. I've watched it a couple of times, and it's very powerful and it's very realistic. And the beating is horrific. It's hard to watch. But if you've watched it and you've been disgusted by how realistic it was, understand this, that doesn't even come close to how bad Jesus was beaten. Isaiah said he was marred beyond human likeness. He was so disfigured, he was not even recognizable. And after that, and after carrying his cross to the top of that hill, and in fact, he had to have help carrying it. Simon of Cyrene ended up carrying it the last little bit for him. After getting up there, they dropped the cross member onto the main bar, and they laid Jesus' body out across that piece of wood, and they drove spikes into his hands and into his feet, securing him to that tree. He was broken physically. He had been broken relationally. He had been broken emotionally. And then they lifted that cross up and they dropped it into the ground, and it came down with a thud, and it tore at his hands and it tore at his feet. It pulled his arms out of the sockets. He was broken. For nothing that he did, he was broken. And finally, he was broken spiritually. Now, be careful how you hear me. I am not saying that Jesus lost his faith. He did not lose his faith. He was the Son of God. He was the Messiah. He was holy man, holy God. But he was broken. And I'll repeat it again. He was broken emotionally. He was broken relationally. He was broken physically. And finally, he was broken spiritually. After hanging on the cross and enduring the mocking of the priests and watching his mother watch him suffer, fighting for every breath. Around noontime, the sun went black, the sky went black, and the sin of the world was laid upon his shoulders. And at that moment, the Father turned away, because the Bible says that he cannot look upon sin, and all of the sin of all mankind was laid upon his Son as he hung on that cross. And Jesus' only response was to cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, you've probably heard those words before. If you've ever heard an Easter message, you've probably heard those words before. But I want you to think about something tonight that I don't think we think about very often. And in fact, it just struck me earlier today. When Jesus cried out, he was so broken spiritually from having his Father turn away, from having the weight of the sin of the world laid upon his shoulders, that he couldn't even call him Father as he had done earlier, as he had done in the garden, praying, Father, take this cup. He couldn't call him Father. That intimacy seemed to be broken. And he simply called him God. And he cried out in anguish, my God, why? Why? And with one more cry, he breathed his last. And he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom. That curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place. That curtain that made it impossible for anybody except for the high priest to go in and make atonement before God. And he could only do it once a year. That curtain that was some 18 inches thick was torn in two. At the same time, there was a great earthquake, shook the town, split rocks open. Let me tell you something. On that Friday, when Jesus died, no one was rejoicing. No, certainly not his friends and his family. But not even the priests were rejoicing. They were scared. Never had they even imagined the temple curtain could be torn. And there it was, torn. What are they going to do now? Great earthquake and a black sky for 3 hours. They were so scared, they began trying to figure out how to cover their tracks. They eventually asked Pilate to post a guard at the tomb where Jesus was laid, thinking that somebody might steal, that the disciples might steal the body of Jesus. They thought that they were going to be able to keep him down. The centurion that was in charge of Jesus' murder, he didn't rejoice. In fact, he got scared and he declared, surely this was the Son of God. Can you imagine being in his place, realizing that you are the one that put him to death physically? Not even, I don't even think that centurion understood sin. I don't think he understood. I mean, he knew what sin was, but I don't think he understood that Jesus was dying for his sin. But just understanding that he had just murdered the Son of God. Oh, it probably wasn't the first innocent man he had killed, but it's the only Son of God. He'd killed him. Nobody was rejoicing on that day. And so I just want you to think tonight, I want you to be praying tonight and tomorrow as we prepare for Sunday, that what has become known as Good Friday to us and for us on that day was anything but. It was anything but. But also so that I don't leave you totally down. I don't want this to be a total downer of a message. There was one and only one person there that day, present that day, that was able to smile through the tears and the pain. We don't know his name, but we know this. He was a thief that was dying on a cross right next to Jesus. And he was able to smile through the tears and the pain, not because Jesus died, but because Jesus made a promise to him before he died that his sins were forgiven and that he would be in paradise that day. He's the only one that could rejoice on that day. The reason I mention that is there may be somebody watching this, either while it's being done live or maybe you're watching it later, and you can relate to that thief. You can relate to that man who was dying for his sins against God and against humanity. He was rightfully being punished. Except right now you find yourself without hope. You find yourself in fear, knowing that if you were to die right now, although it would be just, it would be fearful. I want to leave you with this tonight, that just like that thief got assurance from Jesus before he died and was forgiven at that last moment, a deathbed conversion, you too can be forgiven right now. You too can have the assurance that if you were to die tonight, if you were to die today, that you would go to be in paradise with Jesus. What's it take? Well, I'll tell you, all that thief said was, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He expressed his faith in who Jesus was and his sorrow for what he had done. That's all you need to do. Would you do that? I'm going to close in prayer. And again, I encourage all of you watching and listening, think about these things. Think about the brokenness of Jesus emotionally, relationally, physically, and spiritually for you and me. It's Friday. Sunday's coming, but it's Friday. Lord, I just want to close this message and ask you to move on hearts. Jesus, I pray that you would encourage those who are downtrodden, that you would draw the lost, that you would bring healing and hope for those who have never experienced it before. Lord, I pray salvation tonight for many. And Lord, for your people, those who know you, those who serve you, Lord, that are called by your name. Lord, I pray that this Easter, this weekend would be anything but normal, would be anything but run-of-the-mill, anything but standard. Lord, I pray that even beginning tonight, you would begin to challenge our hearts and draw us close to you. Lord, that you would stir us. And Jesus, that this might be the most incredible Resurrection Sunday that we have ever experienced. Lord, I commit your people now to your grace. In Jesus' wonderful name, amen. Lord bless you. Thank you for being here. Feel free to share this if you like. I'll see you on Sunday.